So rather than talking about exactly what I was talking about in the Africa array, I've kind of mixed it up a little bit, but we're still really talking about how rifting in Southern Africa works, and in particular towards the southern end of the rift, where rifting is just beginning. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of studies that we've done in the Malawian Rift using a relatively small scale geophone deployment there. Talk about some of the issues that are interesting there, and what we can say with the data that we've collected. I'm then going to talk a little bit about where the rift is going from Malawi. So looking at some particularly tectonic geomorphology. I've thrown in an aeromagnetic slide as well, looking at kind of faulting in Mozambique and the Limpopo belt. And then we'll talk a little bit about some kind of wider issues as well. And this work is done with a big team of people from UCT and from outside of UCT. So in particular, in terms of the lead authors of the people that whose work I'm presenting here, it's Vicky Stevens, who did a postdoc in my lab a few years ago. Liam Nell, whose main supervisor is my colleague at UCT, Diego Quiros. I'm a co-supervisor who's just finishing his MSc. Anzani Ramagadani, who's just finishing his PhD now. And then we've got a number of collaborators and other people that helped out during the process. Okay, so to begin with, we're going to be talking about the rift within Malawi. And so the kind of target area is shown over there by the small white box. This is basically close to the southern end of the western branch of the rift. And so it's in an area where the rift is relatively young, so there hasn't been very much rifting there. There isn't significant volcanism or kind of magmatism. So we're really looking at the period right at the beginning of the formation of the rift. And it's an area that I've been really interested in since before I came to Southern Africa, partly because my PhD supervisor back in 1997, he wrote a paper on the Balila Matakataka fault here and said that it showed evidence of really, really large earthquakes. And that's something which has actually been backed up by kind of further studies later on. So in particular, work that was done by people in Bristol and Cardiff during the Prepare project, and we were also partners on that project at UCT. So this Hodge paper in 2020 said that they found evidence for normal faulting earthquakes with magnitudes, and there's a big range depending on scaling relationships that you use, but of around magnitude 7.5, which is kind of above the normal upper limit for continental normal faulting events. So it's something which is very interesting, particularly in an area which is so immature, so structurally immature. And this area is also interesting because there have been a few very deep earthquakes recorded teleseismically. So events like the 6.3 Salima earthquake, and there's been some suggestion that these events may even go into the mantle. And we do know that, I mean, even though that 6.3 event is the largest kind of recently recorded event, if we go a little bit further to the south into Mozambique here, the Makazi earthquake from 2007, that was a magnitude 7. So we do know very large earthquakes can occur in the region. So we made a deployment of 3.5 hertz geophones within this area immediately to the south of Lake Malawi. And this is in the area where we have the Matakataka fault, so the BMF here. And so we looked to see what we could see. The circles that you can see on this figure are colored by the depth of the earthquakes, and you can see that the Salima earthquake, that 6.3, is around 30 kilometers. And you can see that there's a single earthquake that's been previously reported at 44 kilometers depth. So that probably would be in the upper mantle in this area. So that was also one of the things we wanted to look into. So looking a little bit at the geomorphology, you can see these two quite clear fault scarps. So you can see large steps in the topography. But when you look in detail close up, you also see smaller, sharper steps around 15 to 30 meters, depending on where you look, which are indicating that probably both of these faults have been recently active. And the Balilla fault in particular has been highlighted as a potential source of significant hazard. Probably together, these scarps are both rooting into a kind of larger scale border fault. Because if you think about these faults kind of going down all the way through the crust, the fact they're just a couple of kilometers away from each other up here in the north suggests that they may well kind of merge at depth. So this is really my first results slide. So we did this kind of the old-fashioned way. So we use a kind of short-term average, long-term average ratio to detect potential arrivals within the kind of 3-month period that the instruments were recording, and then manually inspected all of them to decide whether or not they really look like earthquakes and to align the first arrivals correctly, picking the P arrivals and the S arrivals. More recent studies, this one was published in 2021, so more recent studies we've done like this, we've been using SizeBench for a kind of AI-assisted picking, although we have found with those that the accuracy of the picks do still require a little bit of human nudging to get really good locations. But if we look at these, again, these are colored by depth. We can see the bunch of blue earthquakes in the west, indicating shallow depths. And then as we move to the east, we're seeing kind of warmer and warmer colors, indicating deeper and deeper events. And this is just the zoom in on the right here. I'll note that we also picked up a bunch of clusters of events from outside of the network. So for instance, in this area here, so these are mining events, right? And the arc is just because it's outside of our network, so we can get the distance from the network very accurately from the P to S arrival times, but they're spread out because we can't get the direction between the earthquake and the network so well with this narrow station spacing. These are not really kind of so important. So focusing in on our actual study area, we can also see there are a few shallower earthquakes over here on the eastern side of the rift. So kind of suggesting that we're seeing earthquakes on the kind of fault dipping in the opposite direction on the other side as well. So if we have a look at a cross section through these events, and I should just note that we used VLS to kind of perform a joint inversion for the velocity structure, as well as the earthquake locations. That's what's shown over here on the left. And you can see that we do have kind of a nice kind of plane of seismicity going down all the way from the surface down to around 35 kilometers. The focal mechanisms are from these larger earthquakes, which have been recorded by regional catalogs over a longer period of time. The uncertainties, the location uncertainties on these are going to be much larger, but you can see that the focal mechanism here, the likely fault plane does align reasonably well with the orientation of our plane of seismicity. You can also see there's some shallower earthquakes within the rift, so those are probably intra-rift faults also showing some activity. And if you kind of look up at the top here, you can see that there is some kind of topographic signature associated with intra-rift faulting as well. And if you just look at the depth histogram, you can see there's kind of like a really nice pattern with earthquakes going all the way through the crust, no clear kind of mid-crustal zone, which is less seismic. And when we were looking at this, I mean, we really concluded that what we're seeing here is evidence for seismicity all the way through the entire crust. And we kind of inferred that that meant that it was possible for individual earthquakes to rupture potentially all the way from the base here, where most of the large earthquakes, which we have recorded in this area, have occurred potentially up to the surface. And so that could potentially account for those really large magnitude 7.5 events that the geomorphologists were talking about. And just to kind of emphasize that, we don't really expect to see magnitude 7.5 normal faults. This is a compilation by Neely and Stein, done at about the same time. And this is basically all of the continental earthquakes from the global CMT catalog. So over a kind of 50, 60-year time period all around the world. And the colors here are the type of earthquake arranged by the p-axis plunge. So where we've got a steep p-axis and these pink purple colors, that means we're looking at normal faults. And you can see they only barely break magnitude 7. So for there to be a magnitude 7.3, 7.4, 7.5, it is quite surprising, especially in an area which is, not a particularly mature rift. Although actually that could be why you get larger earthquakes here. So, I mean, as we know, if you have a larger rupture area, you can potentially have a larger magnitude. And so potentially these areas where you're getting microseismicity and therefore perhaps, major earthquakes rupturing all the way down to 30 kilometers, that gives you potentially a much larger rupture area and so potentially a larger magnitude. When Neely and Stein were doing this compilation, really one of their conclusions was that the reason that normal faults were likely to have smaller maximum magnitudes was basically just that they weren't able to support as much stress to then be released as strike slip and reverse faults. And one of the reasons for that is that faults are simply weaker in extensional regimes compared to compressional regimes. But it's also quite possibly partly because where you have lots of normal faulting, you've weakened the crust, you have high geothermal gradients because you've advected the asthenosphere closer to the surface. You're likely to have relatively narrow seismogenic thicknesses, and so you're not failing at very great depths. And one of the key things actually is if you do rupture at very great depths, because the normal stresses are so large there, because the lithostatic pressure is so large at those depths, then it actually requires even more stress to make the fault fail. It can support even more stress. And so again, that might hinder why some normal faults are quite large. And it's noticeable that Makazi Mozambique earthquake that I mentioned before is one of these magnitude 7 normal faulting earthquakes that we're seeing here. So, I mean, one of the largest normal faulting earthquakes in the CMT catalog is kind of next door to South Africa, just over the border in Mozambique. Now, we made that argument, but then actually the people that we were working with on this project published a paper later on, kind of a more theoretical modeling paper, suggesting kind of a slightly different model. And I mean, what they were saying is actually an argument that has been made in the literature before in various ways, which is basically that when you look at the stresses available to drive rifting, including in the Eastern African rift system, they're often not that high. So, I mean, they're thought to be on the order of 100 megapascals in the Eastern African rift system. But if you have an anhydrous rheology, so somewhere like Malawi, where you've maybe dehydrated the crust and metamorphosed it to kind of granulite grade metamorphism, dehydration through partial melting during a kind of orogenic event like the Pan-African orogeny, this can generate extremely strong lower crustal rocks, extremely strong rheologies. And this triangle here, this is just showing you the shear stress required for failure under certain assumptions, going down to 40 kilometers. If you have this kind of very strong rheological makeup. And what you can see is that the shear stresses that it can support are going to kind of, 600 or 700 megapascals. So in this paper in 2024, they basically argued that it wasn't possible for the whole crust to be strong and deforming seismically because it would simply be too strong in order to deform in that case. And so they said that what there must be is an interconnected weak zone within the crust associated with a shear zone, most likely, involving kind of well-aligned, weaker minerals, so probably quartz and fine-grained feldspar, if you've heated it up enough to get rid of any phyllosilicates or anything like that, which could also kind of form a weak zone. And so they basically argued that what must be happening is that in these lower parts of the Malawian crust, it actually must be mainly this interconnected weak layer, which is then very strong at these lower crustal depths. And there must just be a few kind of individual stronger patches which are still failing seismically. That was kind of the inference that they made. I mean, those patches must be quite big in some cases because we do get earthquakes up to a magnitude 6.3, the Salima earthquake, which I mentioned before. So that is going to have a size on the order of kilometers. So we're not talking about kind of tiny strong patches, but still, they said that it was very unlikely that a single earthquake could rupture the whole crust. And so to investigate this a bit further, Liam Nell, who did his MSc with me, and his main supervisor was Diego Quiros, and we also had some help from Jay Pulliam at Baylor. He did some body wave tomography using the same data set and the same earthquakes, which we'd already recorded, in order to try and kind of image what's going on. So here you can see some of the kind of wave paths which are being taken. You can see that kind of in the area immediately underneath the network, we've got quite good density of crossing paths. You can also see there are some of these steep lines coming straight up from below. So that's because we also added some teleseismic events to the data set to get a bit more coverage. And we're using the FM Tomo fast marching method, which is a kind of freely available source code developed by Nick Rawlinson. We modified the AK135 kind of standards starting velocity model. Basically, we had to remove the mid-crustal interface because, I mean, it's a global model. We don't really think that there's an interface at that particular depth at that point. And by using a gradient rather than a sharp interface, we got rid of a bunch of phases, which are very likely erroneously being modeled as kind of head waves within that interface. As is usual, when you're doing kind of tomography, you have to set a smoothing and damping parameters to try and balance. I'm getting as good a data fit as possible without kind of overfitting it and basically having a very kind of patchy model, which is very unstable, which is basically kind of fitting the noise within your data. And so, yeah, these points here are just showing you the values that we chose for that trade-off. And just to show you kind of a checkerboard chest. So this is kind of across the whole area where we detected earthquakes. So it's only the bit in the center, which is actually underneath the network. And so this is the only area we would really expect to get good coverage. So you can see basically this is the area under the network here. And you can say we do a reasonable job of recovering this kind of checkerboard reference kind of fake velocity model, going down to around 25 kilometers. So as you get deeper than that, I just go back, because as you go deeper and deeper, more and more of the events are above you. And so you have fewer and fewer crossing rays. And so the velocity anomalies tend to become more and more smeared. But basically, within this section, immediately under the array, down to about 25 kilometers, we think we have something pretty good. We've got the travel time residuals here. That's both the teleseismic and the local residuals together. We probably should separate them out. I think that the teleseismic ones are the source of a lot of the larger residuals. But this is, again, just to show you the results from this. And in particular, I want you to look at these east-west cross sections going across the rift. And interestingly, all the way along, there is a dipping zone of relatively low velocity. So we're talking about 1 kilometer per second, less than the average at that depth. Dipping kind of all the way down as far as we have resolution, and then it kind of smears beyond that, but then it becomes not reliable. And this zone of relatively low velocities comes to the surface or reaches the surface where the scarps that we were talking about come to the surface. So basically, we get this very prominent eastward dipping low velocity anomaly all the way through the crust associated with the kind of feature which also has these earthquakes associated with it, which is quite interesting. So one way I think you could reasonably interpret this is that the zone which these earthquakes are exploiting is compositionally different from the material on either side of it within the basement. So that kind of fits in with the kind of Fagerung model of there being a kind of shear zone or some weak zone which is being reactivated, enabling this fault to actually propagate all the way through the crust, even though the stresses that are available for driving that deformation aren't necessarily as high as some of the modeling studies would suggest that you need to actually get rifting going. Now, I do not think I would necessarily go as far as saying that this kind of proves that you couldn't get a single earthquake rupturing all the way down. When you are doing this type of modeling, when you're doing these kind of calculations, there are quite a lot of assumptions that go into it. There are quite a lot of ways that you can kind of reduce the strength, particularly if you can invoke minerals with a lower coefficient of friction, which would reduce the slope here. If you can get fluids down the fault zone, that can also reduce the normal stresses, particularly where the permeability is low. But there is at least a prima facie case for some quite large zone of different material, which is probably weaker, extending all the way down at this same kind of 45-degree angle. Okay, so that's kind of the end of the first section of the talk. So that's kind of talking about this little study up here in the Malawian Rift. What happens further south? So where does the rift go from there? So, I mean, if we look at this kind of compilation of earthquakes and faults, we can kind of see quite clearly that there is deformation coming down through the Arima Graben. And then after that, there's some kind of maybe disagreement in the literature. In the past, a lot of people put the boundary coming down the kind of eastern coast of Mozambique in this area. After the earthquake that occurred in Mozambique, the magnitude 7 event, then that kind of drew people's eye kind of more in this direction. And Chris Hartnady, who a lot of you all know, identified this area of the Mazenga Graben as being a potential continuation of the rift zone. And so I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about that because Anza Ramagadani has been doing some work in that area as part of his PhD. So this is a really nice topographic image that he collected, that he put together. And what you can see very clearly here are these complex set of graben. They're about 10 kilometers wide, so they're much narrower than the graben that we see further north in places like Malawi. That may well be associated with a much smaller seismogenic thickness, so brittle faulting only going down 10 kilometers or so, or perhaps even less. You can also see that there's this quite prominent dome in this area. So, you know, the topography gradually increases as you get to the top. You get all of these discontinuities, and then it gets slopes down again towards the sea as you move to the other side. And there was this recent paper looking at a few seismic lines which were collected across these grabens for kind of hydrocarbon exploration purposes. And what you can see is the very clear synrift sequences that are Jurassic and very early Cretaceous in age. And then after that, you get some kind of nice layer cake post-rift sequences. But these post-rift sequences are all offset by fairly constant amounts all the way through, indicating a much more recent period of activity. And these faults come to the surface where you see this topographic expression at the modern day. So Ans has been looking at quantifying the kind of surface expression of this faulting, and they're quite significant. So the heights of these scarps are kind of 50 to 60 meters. I keep wanting to say kilometers, even though I should be talking about meters, 50 to 60 meters. And one of the interesting things here is as you like move along the scarps, you see these kind of prominent kind of drops in the height of the scarp. And those are associated often with what looks like paleo drainage. So for instance, here you can perhaps see where there may have been a river running from the interior, running all the way to the east. It doesn't run like that anymore. So you can see like places like this, where what looks like an ancient river channel has been abandoned because it's been uplifted by these kind of faulted blocks. And so that's, again, maybe a sign that we're looking at something which is relatively young and has kind of changed the direction of the river flow as this kind of doming and faulting has occurred. And looking to sort of integrating this with another group's work. So there was a deployment in this area, the Mozart experiment, which was a collaboration between Mozambican and I believe kind of workers from Portugal. And so they published in 2016 this Dominguez et al. Paper where they used ambient noise tomography. And one of the interesting things which I think about this paper is that they kind of identify this area with relatively low group velocities at relatively long periods. So kind of suggesting that underneath this dome, you're getting kind of low wave speeds, perhaps associated with some kind of upwelling. So kind of asthenospheric processes that could be giving you this domal uplift and then triggering this most recent period of fault activity, which is then exposed so nicely in the surface. Now, interestingly, that experiment also looked at kind of microseismicity or the earthquakes which they recorded in the area. And what you can see is that they found very little microseismicity in the area of these Mazenga Graben. Admittedly, the network isn't quite as dense here, but it's still quite interesting that there is so little. And so that's something which, requires further work and further investigation. These really do look very kind of fresh and active. And again, we can see that they're clearly kind of late Cenozoic from the offsets and the seismics. But if these were really the kind of like modern day propagation of the Eastern African rift system, it's perhaps surprising that there's not some microseismicity in there as well. But if you do look at these earthquakes, what you see is them kind of wrapping around the edge of the Zimbabwe craton here, and again, around the edge of this area of relatively high wave speeds. So, likely the kind of stronger, older rheological material. And this is actually leading towards South Africa here into this area, which would be kind of geologically classified as a Limpopo belt. And specifically, when you look at the Limpopo belt, when you look in detail, there is evidence of active faulting in this area as well, and it's particularly associated with the Karoo aged basin. So here, the Karoo is not a kind of retro-forearc basin. These are kind of fault-bounded basins. You can see these kind of yellow colors of the Letaba basalts, and there are some other Karoo formations here as well. And you can also see in brown here what's been mapped as quaternary sediments, quaternary cover. So relatively young material. And if you particularly look at this patch of quaternary cover, you can see the Bosbok-Port fault here is cutting over it. And if we look at a digital elevation model of this area, so that zone of quaternary sediments is in this area here. So basically crossing the fault in the box, which is labeled with a 3. This digital elevation model is made through stereophotogrammetry using aerial photographs from the South African government. And you can see in the slope map a very nice clear scarp, and you can see this scarp continues nicely through the area of quaternary cover, really quite convincingly showing that there has been some relatively recent activity on this. And if you look at the height of the scarp, it's got around 10 meters of throw on it, especially in this kind of well-recorded zone where it cuts through the quaternary sediments. And if you take the length of the scarp that you can map, so it's 55 kilometers long, that would be consistent if you take kind of the usual scaling relationships. That would be consistent with around about magnitude 7 earthquakes, with around about 3 meters of slip in each earthquake. So that 10 meters isn't a single earthquake, just like the 20-meter scarps we were looking at in Malawi weren't in a single earthquake. And there's actually, when you look in detail at the scarp, some other evidence for this, in that there's a kind of 3-meter high, steeper subscarp within the kind of higher scarp, which might potentially represent the most recent event. And if we look at some aeromagnetic data from this area, so the BOSS F here, so this is the fault that we were just looking at, and you can see how clearly this follows one of these major boundaries within the aeromagnetic data. And I mean, this aeromagnetic data is basically picking up the Karoo basins in particular. That's what's kind of dominating it. And if you continue looking at some of these other faults, another one that also shows this nice relationship with the aeromagnetic data is the Chapeze fault, which kind of runs through here to the north of the Chapeze Basin and also the Mopani Basin. And actually, this fault also shows a nice clear step, a nice clear scarp, including in areas where it cuts through quaternary sediments. And this is somewhere where we actually know kind of 100% this has been active within the last few 100,000 years, because this was actually trenched as part of ESCOM kind of nuclear safety project. And so an international team trenched the fault and identified what they interpreted to be a number of surface rupturing events taking place at this Skull Point location here. Okay, so I'm going to zoom out a little bit now to talk a little bit about not just kind of the traditional Eastern African rift system, but kind of where else faulting and large earthquakes could occur. So we're looking at the kind of topographic map here, and then we also have faults shown in black with evidence for recent activity, and also the kind of recent earthquakes. I've made the ones in Gauteng to gray because they're most likely, at least to some extent, associated with mining rather than being natural tectonic earthquakes. And a few things to note. So you've got extensive faulting and earthquakes through the Damara belt. There's some evidence of these faults in the Limpopo belt, some small number of earthquakes. I mean, you can actually extend these faults into Botswana, where the Moyabana earthquake happened. So that was a magnitude 6.5, sometimes called the Central Kalahari earthquake. And since then, there's also been some scarps kind of identified within this region as well. So with this more northwest southeast trend. And so you can kind of get the idea that there's faulting and earthquakes coming through the Limpopo belt and then coming up into Botswana. There's also faulting and earthquakes coming down around the side of the Zimbabwe craton here. There's also very clearly deformation within the Damara Belt, kind of the so-called southwestern branch of the rift. So basically, you have evidence of neotectonics all the way around the Zimbabwe craton, kind of acting as a little rigid kind of nugget in the center and localizing deformation all the way around the edge. There were also some kind of more isolated places. So the Zadi complex fault here, which Kumo has been working on. There's also evidence for faulting in Namibia that we've recently worked on. And it's interesting to ask kind of what's controlling this particular pattern, what controls where the earthquakes are likely to happen in the future. So one possible answer is that it could be kind of primarily controlled by kind of lithosphere structure. So we know that in this area, we've got these cratonic regions, so areas which are often thought of being as very old, with buoyant, cold, thick lithosphere underneath them. And that cold, thick lithosphere can basically act to strengthen them and to protect them from deformation. And if you actually kind of look at the pattern of deformation that occurs, the kind of evidence for this being the dominant control is kind of mixed. There's maybe some truth in that, in the sense that in this kind of Central African plateau region, you do get this broad area of earthquakes and faulting, which quite nicely separates these two areas of relatively thick lithosphere, so the Congo craton over here. But then you also have areas where you clearly see earthquakes occurring in the center of these areas of thick lithosphere. In the Limpopo belt, we see this evidence for relatively large earthquakes penetrating into this area of thick lithosphere, in the Luangwa Rift as well, and even in the Okavango kind of rift zone slash Okavango Basin, the faults seem to go into these areas of high lithosphere. Now, that may in part be because when we're looking at a tomographic model from Chele et al. 2020, this is a kind of continent scale model. And so although they've used a lot of data, the resolution is not going to be perfect. So, I mean, part of the reason that this may not match up so well in places is because we may just be missing kind of thin, like narrow areas of thinner lithosphere. But I'm not convinced it's purely that. And actually, when you plot out the kind of fault-bounded Karoo basins, you see that many of them kind of correlate really nicely with a lot of the activity that we see. So in very many cases, the faults which are being reactivated and seem to be failing in these fairly major earthquakes are actually basically Karoo age normal faults, which are just being reactivated a little bit in kind of modern times. And so in terms of thinking about hazards, these are very slowly deforming faults. They're not likely to have big earthquakes very often. But in terms of where large earthquakes could happen, it's perhaps particularly these Karoo basins, which are among the most hazardous. And basically what's happening here is that this whole area is elevated. It has gravitational potential energy. We're seeing spreading across this whole region, and it's just taking up a little bit of deformation anywhere where one of these pre-existing weak zones lies. In other places like Namibia, we can see that it's associated not necessarily with Karoo basins and normal faults, but instead with older Pan-African shear zones similar to what we were looking at in Malawi. So that would be something like the Pofadder Marshall Rock shear zone in Namibia to South Africa, along which one of these faults over here occurred. Now, when we look at the faults that we've worked on in Southern Africa, so you can see kind of a whole set of kind of fault traces here, and they're drawn up at the same scale as a number of earthquake ruptures from more rapidly deforming regions. And, you know, these are quite major earthquakes, right? The Corinth, Greece one, this isn't a single earthquake. This is a kind of series of individual faults that failed in different earthquakes. This is an example of one single earthquake within Corinth. The 1887 Sonora earthquake is kind of the largest normal faulting event which has been recorded. Obviously, there's uncertainty about its magnitude given its age, but this is and one of the only ones which we think probably did get up to those kind of mid-magnitude sevens in terms of kind of normal faulting magnitude. And you can see that a lot of these faults in southern Africa are a similar kind of scale and also kind of have a similar lack of complexity, so a straightness as that 1887 Sonora event. So that's kind of interesting. Like they look much simpler and longer than, for instance, these earthquakes in places like Italy and Turkey. And this is likely partly because they aren't kind of mature modern rifts, so they haven't been heated up. You haven't had thinning of the lithosphere and associated increase in the geothermal heat flow, which kind of keeps your seismogenic layer thin and keeps potentially your fault segments relatively short. Instead, you've got something which hasn't deformed much within the kind of last few tens of millions of years, but it's reactivating an older, very mature structure, either a shear zone or one of these Karoo-aged rift-bounding normal faults. And so it's kind of, despite not having deformed very much, that's straight enough and long enough as a pre-existing weakness that can be exploited, allowing relatively large earthquakes to occur. And so you're not necessarily, it allows you to have big earthquakes that you might think, a fault would need to kind of evolve towards over like many, many events without a significant amount of recent deformation. Okay, so I do have some slides on other things which I should talk about, but I think that's probably about the right time. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Alastair. Really appreciate your time. We do have a bit of time for a few questions. If anyone has a question.
Yes.
Right, go ahead.
Uh,